everything was fine. The patrol moved through the jungle with the confidence of men who owned this territory. 7 soldiers of the Viet Cong D 445 Battalion, armed alert, following a trail they had walked 100 times before. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, 5 of them were dead. Not wounded, not caught in an ambush they could fight their way out of. Dead. The 2 survivors never saw the enemy, never heard a warning, never fired a shot in return. One moment their comrades were alive, the next they were corpses arranged in a pattern that would haunt Vietnamese fighters for the next 5 years. And you know what made it worse? The enemy left a calling card, an ace of spades tucked carefully into each dead man's collar, fluttering in the jungle breeze like a promise. This wasn't the Americans. The Americans you could hear coming from kilometers away, their helicopters announcing their presence, their radio chatter filling the air, their artillery preparing the battlefield with thunder. This was something else entirely. Something that moved through the jungle without disturbing a single leaf. Something that killed without warning and vanished without trace. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts. And when the survivors of that patrol made it back to their base camp, when they tried to explain what had happened, their commander didn't believe them. How could he? How could 5 armed soldiers simply cease to exist while 2 others stood 10 meters away? But the bodies told a story the survivors couldn't. Bodies positioned with deliberate care. Weapons placed just so. Eyes that would never close, staring at something terrible the living couldn't see. And those cards, always those cards. You're about to discover why a force of barely 150 men achieved what 500,000 Americans could not. Why Viet Cong units refused orders to patrol in certain areas. Why the mere rumor of their presence could cause battle-hardened guerrillas to abandon positions they had held for years. This is the story of the Australian SAS in Vietnam, told not through Western archives or military historians, but through the terrified whispers of the men they hunted. And fair warning, what you're about to hear is going to fundamentally change how you understand jungle warfare, psychological operations, and the true meaning of fear. The arrival, May 1966, Nui Dat, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment stepped off transport aircraft into a war zone that had already consumed tens of thousands of lives. 120 men, not a division, not even a full battalion. 120 operators rotating through Vietnam in squadrons of roughly 40 men each, expected to provide reconnaissance and intelligence gathering for the entire 1st Australian Task Force. The American liaison officers were polite. Some were even curious, but none of them expected much. After all, what could such a small force accomplish in a war that was devouring soldiers by the thousands? The U.S. had committed over 500,000 troops to Vietnam by 1968. The Australian contribution, including infantry, artillery, engineers, and support personnel, would peak at around 8,000 total personnel in country. The SAS contingent represented a fraction of that fraction, but numbers, as the Viet Cong would discover, told only part of the story. The Australian SAS arrived in Vietnam with credentials that most American units lacked. They had learned their craft not in training facilities designed for conventional warfare, but in the jungles of Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation of 1963 to 1966. There, in terrain that made Vietnam look hospitable, they had conducted secret cross-border operations against Indonesian regulars and communist insurgents. operations that required them to move through hostile territory for weeks at a time, without support, without extraction options, without the safety net of overwhelming firepower that American doctrine assumed as baseline. They had learned patience. They had learned silence. Most importantly, they had learned that in jungle warfare, the side that sees first wins. Everything else was commentary. The regiment's commander in those early months understood something fundamental about the nature of the conflict in Vietnam. This was not a war that would be won by seizing and holding territory. The Viet Cong didn't defend positions in the traditional sense. They flowed through the landscape like water, appearing where they were strong, vanishing where they were weak, always moving, always adapting, always surviving. To fight such an enemy, you had to become like them. No, you had to become better than them. You had to out-guerrilla the guerrillas. The doctrine's standard American operations in Vietnam followed a predictable pattern. Intelligence would identify a suspected enemy position. Artillery would pound the area. Airstrikes would follow, turning jungle into moonscape. Then infantry would sweep through, searching for bodies to add to the count that Saigon used to measure progress. The problem was simple. By the time the infantry arrived, the enemy was gone. Warned by the sound of approaching helicopters, the scream of artillery shells, the roar of jet engines, they would slip into their tunnel networks or simply melt into the jungle, waiting for the Americans to leave so they could return and rebuild. The Australians looked at this approach and recognized it for what it was: theater. Expensive, loud, impressive theater that accomplished little except giving the enemy advance warning of every move. Australian SAS doctrine rejected every assumption underlying American tactics. Where Americans moved in company or platoon strength, 40 to 200 men crashing through the jungle like an avalanche, Australian patrols consisted of 5 to 6 men. Where Americans relied on radio communication and called in fire support at the first sign of contact, Australians maintained absolute silence for days at a time, watching, learning, mapping enemy movements without revealing their presence. Where Americans announced their arrival with helicopter insertions, rotor wash flattening vegetation, and announcing to every enemy within kilometers that troops were being deployed, Australians walked in. They would insert via helicopter kilometers away from their actual target area, then move on foot through terrain that erased their passage. Some patrols would spend the first 2 days of an operation simply getting into position, moving at a pace that would cover perhaps 5 kilometers in 12 hours. To an American commander, used to measuring progress in kilometers gained and enemy killed, this seemed absurdly cautious. To the Australians, it was the difference between hunting and being hunted. But the real innovation, the element that would make Australian SAS operations legendarily effective, lay not in their movement or their tactics, but in their psychology. They did not see themselves as soldiers conducting counterinsurgency operations. They saw themselves as hunters, and hunters do not fight fair. The trackers among the Australian forces in Vietnam were men whose presence the Australian government would not officially acknowledge for decades. Aboriginal soldiers, recruited from communities that had survived in some of Earth's harshest environments for over 40,000 years by developing skills that Western military training could not replicate. Approximately 300 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander personnel served in Vietnam, though the exact number remains uncertain due to incomplete record-keeping and the fact that some indigenous soldiers were not officially identified as such during the war. They served in infantry battalions, artillery units, engineering corps, and, most significantly for this story, in reconnaissance elements attached to SAS squadrons. These men brought to Vietnam capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to observers unfamiliar with traditional tracking methods. They could determine the age of a footprint to within hours by examining the moisture content of disturbed soil. They could identify individual enemy soldiers by the unique pattern of their sandal wear. They could smell the difference between a Vietnamese diet of rice and fish sauce and the Western rations carried by Allied forces from hundreds of meters downwind. In the dense jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province, where visibility rarely exceeded 10 meters and conventional reconnaissance methods relied heavily on chance, these skills transformed the nature of intelligence gathering. An American patrol might spend days searching for enemy signs and find nothing. An Australian patrol with an Aboriginal tracker would know within hours how many enemy had passed through an area, when they had passed, where they were going, and approximately how long ago they had left. But the trackers brought something more than technical skill. They brought a fundamental understanding that would separate Australian operations from American methods. In the traditional worldview of Australia's indigenous peoples, hunting was not simply about killing prey. It was about understanding the prey, learning its patterns, knowing where it would be before it got there, becoming so attuned to the rhythms of the land that you could move through it as part of it rather than as an intruder. This was not something that could be taught in a 6-week training course. This was cultural knowledge accumulated over millennia and passed down through generations. And when applied to the problem of tracking enemy soldiers through Vietnamese jungle, it produced results that seemed like magic to those who witnessed them. First Blood, the Australian SAS, first encountered the Viet Cong in late May 1966, less than 2 weeks after arriving in country. A 5-man patrol operating near the base at Nui Dat detected movement on a trail used by local guerrillas to move supplies between villages. Standard American procedure would have been to call in artillery or air support, destroy the enemy from a distance. The Australians did neither. They watched for 11 hours, lying in positions so carefully chosen that enemy soldiers passed within meters of them without detection, they observed. They counted enemy personnel. They noted weapons carried. They identified unit insignia. They mapped the route with precision that would allow future operations to interdict this supply line at the most effective point. And then, when darkness fell and the trail was empty, they moved, not to extract, to reposition. They set an ambush at a trail junction 300 meters from their observation point, a location their tracking had identified as a frequent rest stop for enemy patrols. At first light, a 3-man Viet Cong element arrived at exactly the spot the Australians had predicted. They never knew what hit them. Claymore mines and precisely aimed rifle fire from concealed positions. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 4 seconds. 3 enemy killed. 0 Australian casualties. 0 indication to any other enemy forces in the area that anything had occurred. The patrol remained in position for another 8 hours. When a second enemy element arrived to investigate the missing patrol, they found their comrades arranged in a specific pattern, sitting upright against trees, eyes open, weapons placed across their laps as if they were simply resting, and in each dead man's collar a playing card, the ace of spades. The psychological effect was immediate. The second enemy patrol, 7 men who had seen combat and survived firefights with American units, panicked. One soldier vomited. Another fired his entire magazine into the jungle at targets that existed only in his imagination. They collected their dead and retreated at nearly a run, abandoning all tactical discipline. The Australians watched them go. They did not fire a shot. They simply observed, noting the direction of retreat, the level of fear, the complete collapse of unit cohesion. Then they withdrew, moving through jungle that closed behind them as if they had never been there at all. When they returned to base and filed their after-action report, American liaison officers struggled to process what had occurred. The patrol had made contact with the enemy twice, eliminated 3 confirmed enemies, caused a second enemy element to break and run, and done all of this while never revealing their position or taking casualties. This was not how war was supposed to work, but for the Viet Cong operating in Phuoc Tuy Province, it was about to become the new reality. The Phantom Doctrine. Over the following months, Australian SAS operations developed a pattern that would become their signature. 5 to 6 man patrols would infiltrate deep into enemy-controlled territory and establish observation posts overlooking trails, river crossings, or suspected base areas. They would remain in these positions for days, sometimes weeks, existing on minimal rations, never lighting fires, never making unnecessary movement, watching the enemy's patterns until they could predict them with near certainty. And then, when the moment was right, they would strike. Not with the overwhelming force that American doctrine prescribed, but with surgical precision designed to achieve maximum psychological effect. The body staging became increasingly sophisticated. Dead enemy soldiers would be found arranged in patterns that exploited Vietnamese superstitions about the dead. Weapons would be positioned to suggest the victims had seen something terrifying in their final moments. Personal effects would be left untouched, but the ace of spades, which Vietnamese folklore had come to associate with death omens, would always be present. Sometimes the Australians would not kill at all. They would simply infiltrate enemy positions at night and leave signs of their presence, footprints that appeared from nowhere and led to nothing. Equipment rearranged while sentries slept. Messages scratched into tree bark in Vietnamese, warning of the ghosts that walked these trails. The effect on Viet Cong morale was devastating. Units that had fought effectively against American forces began refusing patrol assignments in areas where the Phantoms were known to operate. Soldiers deserted rather than enter certain sections of jungle. Political officers reported increasing difficulty maintaining revolutionary fervor when men were convinced they were fighting supernatural enemies, because that was how it felt to the Viet Cong. Supernatural. How else could you explain entire patrols disappearing without a sound? How could you account for soldiers being killed in supposedly secure areas without anyone hearing gunfire? What human enemy could move through jungle so dense you could barely walk without leaving a trail like a highway, yet leave no trace of their passage? The numbers. By 1968, the Australian SAS had developed the most effective kill ratio of any unit in Vietnam. The exact figures varied depending on which records you consulted, but conservative estimates placed it at approximately 17 enemy killed for every Australian casualty. Some operations achieved ratios exceeding 30-1. To put this in perspective, the average American infantry unit in Vietnam achieved roughly a 1-to-1 kill ratio. Even elite American units like MICVSOG rarely exceeded 10-1. The Australians were operating at a level of effectiveness that seemed impossible to replicate. Over the course of nearly 6 years, from 1966 to 1971, Australian and New Zealand SAS personnel in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols. They inflicted at least 492 confirmed enemy killed, with another 106 possible kills, 47 wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded. 580 men served in the SASR in Vietnam during this period. Never more than about 40 operators were in country at any given time, rotating through on year-long deployments. This tiny force, representing less than 1% of total Australian personnel in Vietnam, accounted for a disproportionate percentage of enemy casualties and, more importantly, a massive psychological impact on Viet Cong operations throughout their area of operations. But numbers alone cannot capture the true effect of Australian SAS operations. The real impact lay in the intangible realm of fear, uncertainty, and the gradual erosion of enemy will to fight. The Viet Cong perspective. Captured documents and post-war interviews with former Viet Cong personnel paint a picture of an enemy force that was genuinely terrified of Australian operations. One female former member of the Viet Cong, interviewed decades later for a documentary on Australian Special Forces, stated it clearly. "We were not afraid of the American GIs, Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing. We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear." That word, disappear, not killed, not captured, disappeared, because from the Viet Cong perspective, that was exactly what happened. Men would go out on patrol and simply cease to exist. No bodies would be found, no evidence of combat, no indication of what had occurred, just empty jungle and the growing certainty that something was hunting them. Operational logs from D445 Battalion, the primary Viet Cong unit operating in Phuoc Tuy Province, show a unit gradually descending into paranoia. Early entries describe routine combat operations and confident assessments of victory. Later entries tell a different story. Patrols reported movement that left no trace. Sentries heard sounds, a single snapped twig, a rustle of vegetation, but found nothing when they investigated. Supply routes that had been used safely for years suddenly became death traps, where soldiers vanished during routine movements. By late 1968, D445 Battalion's operational effectiveness had been severely degraded. Not because they had suffered massive casualties, their numerical strength remained substantial, but because their soldiers were too frightened to patrol effectively. Commanders issued orders that went unexecuted because subordinates refused to enter certain areas. Political officers struggled to maintain the narrative of inevitable victory when men were disappearing from positions that should have been secure. One former Viet Cong battalion commander, interviewed by Australian journalist and author years after the war, described the psychological effect in stark terms. He stated that the Australians were worse than the Americans. "When Americans attacked," he explained, "you knew what was coming. The helicopters announced their arrival. Artillery prepared the battlefield. You could break contact and disappear into tunnels or jungle, then return when they left. The Australians were different. They were patient, better guerrilla fighters, better at ambushes. They would set up in your territory and wait, sometimes for days, until you walked into their trap. And unlike the Americans, they did not simply call in artillery and leave. They stayed. They hunted the Mautow Mountains. The Mautow Mountain complex in the northeastern corner of Phuoc Tuy Province represented one of the most significant enemy strongholds in the region. The mountains provided natural defensive positions, cave systems that could shelter troops from airstrikes, and proximity to supply routes running from the Ho Chi Minh Trail network. American and South Vietnamese forces had attempted to clear the Mautow complex multiple times with conventional operations. Large unit sweeps supported by artillery and air power would move through the mountains, engage in brief firefights, and declare the area secure. Within days of their departure, Viet Cong forces would return and resume operations. The problem was that the mountains covered too much area to hold permanently with the forces available, and the cave systems were too deep to destroy with conventional bombing. The enemy could simply wait out any temporary occupation, then emerge when Allied forces moved to other priorities. The Australian solution was characteristically unconventional. Rather than attempt to seize and hold the Mautow Mountains, SAS patrols would infiltrate the area and conduct long-range reconnaissance operations designed to map enemy positions, identify supply routes, and interdict movement without revealing the full extent of Australian surveillance. Between February and December 1969, Australian SAS conducted 17 separate long-range reconnaissance patrols into the Mautow complex. These operations required patrols to operate inside enemy security perimeters for periods of up to 3 weeks at a time, living in hide positions that enemy patrols passed within meters of without detection. The intelligence gathered filled thousands of pages of classified reports. Every cave entrance was mapped, every trail was documented, every water source was identified. The Australians built a picture of enemy operations so detailed that they could predict movement patterns with startling accuracy. But more than intelligence, these operations had a direct psychological effect on enemy forces operating in the mountains. The Viet Cong began seeing ghosts. Sentries reported movement that left no trace. Guards heard sounds but found nothing when they investigated. Soldiers began disappearing during routine activities, water collection, supply runs, sentry rotation, vanishing without evidence of combat or capture. By the end of 1969, D445 Battalion had effectively ceased offensive operations from the Mautow complex, not because they had been driven out by superior force, but because their soldiers were too frightened to function effectively. Movement was restricted to daylight hours only. Patrol routes were changed constantly. Units refused to operate in areas where the phantoms had been reported. The mountains remained in enemy hands on paper, but in practice, Australian SAS operations had rendered them largely useless as a base for offensive action. The Aboriginal connection. The role of Aboriginal trackers in Australian SAS operations remained officially unacknowledged for decades after the war. The Australian government was reluctant to publicize the fact that Indigenous soldiers, many of whom still faced discrimination at home, were being used in combat roles that contradicted the nation's carefully cultivated image of colorblind egalitarianism. But among the SAS operators who worked with Aboriginal trackers, their contribution was never in doubt. These men possessed skills that could not be taught, only inherited through cultural transmission across generations. One tracker could determine from examining a disturbed area of jungle floor exactly how many enemy soldiers had passed through, their approximate weight and height based on depth and spacing of footprints, the load they were carrying based on gait patterns, and crucially, how long ago they had passed based on the rate of vegetation recovery and moisture content of disturbed soil. This was not guesswork. This was reading the jungle the way a scholar reads a book. Every broken twig, every displaced leaf, Every subtle change in the pattern of undergrowth told a story, and Aboriginal trackers who had grown up learning to read the Australian bush found that the same principles applied in Vietnamese jungle. The psychological effect of this capability on enemy forces cannot be overstated. Viet Cong units would attempt to move through jungle without leaving a trail, using every counter-tracking technique they had developed over years of guerrilla warfare. They would walk in streams. They would step only on rocks or logs. They would brush out their tracks behind them, and Australian patrols would follow them anyway, because the trackers were not following footprints. They were following the thousand subtle signs that any movement through jungle creates: the broken spider webs, the disturbed leaf litter, the bent grass that would take hours to spring back to its original position. Signs that were invisible to soldiers trained in Western tracking methods, but clearly visible to men who had learned to read country before they learned to read books. The psychological mechanism, the effectiveness of Australian SAS psychological operations rested on a sophisticated understanding of Vietnamese cultural beliefs about death and the afterlife. Vietnamese Buddhism and folk religion held specific beliefs about proper burial and the fate of those who died far from home without appropriate funeral rites. The belief in wandering souls, spirits of the dead who could not find peace because they had not been properly buried in their homeland, was deeply embedded in Vietnamese culture. These ghosts were believed to haunt the places where they died, bringing misfortune to the living and seeking to lure other souls to join them in their restless wandering. American psychological warfare operations attempted to exploit these beliefs with crude methods. Operation Wandering Soul, perhaps the most famous American PSYOP program, involved playing recordings of ghostly voices and eerie sounds from helicopters and loudspeakers at night. The recordings, created in Saigon studios using South Vietnamese and defected Viet Cong actors, were meant to convince enemy soldiers that the jungle was full of vengeful spirits. The program had mixed results. While some Viet Cong soldiers were reportedly frightened by the recordings, many quickly realized they were listening to tape players rather than actual ghosts. The Viet Cong response was often to open fire on the sound source, which at least had the effect of revealing their positions to Allied forces. Australian operations were far more sophisticated. Rather than announcing their presence with obvious theatricality, they exploited the same cultural beliefs through actions that seemed genuinely supernatural. The staging of bodies was not random. It was designed to create scenarios that aligned with Vietnamese ghost stories. Dead soldiers found sitting upright with their eyes open and weapons in their laps looked as if they had simply fallen asleep on guard duty and died without waking. This aligned with folk tales of spirits that could steal the breath from sleeping men. Soldiers found with expressions of terror and weapons fired wildly in all directions suggested they had seen something in their final moments that drove them mad with fear. Footprints that appeared from nowhere and led nowhere suggested the presence of creatures that could walk between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. And the ace of spades, while not a traditional Vietnamese symbol, had been adopted into local superstition through years of American presence. Vietnamese soldiers had come to associate the card with death, and its presence became a symbol of doom. The genius of Australian psychological operations was that they worked on multiple levels simultaneously. At the conscious level, enemy soldiers knew they were fighting human enemies using sophisticated tactics. But at the subconscious level, In the part of the mind that still believed in the ghost stories their grandmothers told them as children, doubt crept in. What if the stories were true? What if the jungle really was full of vengeful spirits? This psychological uncertainty was far more effective than any amount of crude theater. Because the Australians never claimed to be supernatural, they simply operated in ways that seemed to defy natural explanation and let the enemy's own cultural beliefs do the rest of the work. The training. The transformation of ordinary Australian soldiers into jungle phantoms did not happen by accident. It was the product of a selection and training process so demanding that American observers who witnessed it recommended against attempting to replicate it in U.S. forces. Australian SAS selection began not with physical tests, but with psychological evaluation. Candidates were assessed for a specific personality profile: high pain tolerance, low need for social validation, above-average pattern recognition capabilities, and most importantly, what military psychologists termed predatory patience, the ability to remain absolutely motionless for hours while maintaining complete situational awareness, combined with the willingness to transition to explosive violence after extended periods of inactivity. Only 1 in 12 candidates who began selection completed it. Those who passed entered a training program that lasted 18 months, 3 times longer than U.S. Army Special Forces training of the same era. And a significant portion of that training took place not in jungle warfare schools, but in the Australian outback, learning tracking and fieldcraft techniques from Aboriginal instructors whose methods had never been written down because they existed as oral tradition passed from generation to generation. The boot modification that so shocked American observers was merely the visible symbol of this transformation. Australian SAS operators removed the hard soles from their standard-issue boots because rubber and leather created noise and left distinctive prints. They replaced them with strips of tire rubber cut to match the profile of Vietnamese sandals. From a distance, their footprints were indistinguishable from those of local Vietnamese. From a tracking perspective, they did not exist as Australians at all. They had become something else, creatures of the jungle who happened to carry Western weapons. The legacy. The final American assessment of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam was not completed until 1974, 3 years after the last Australian combat troops departed. The report, classified top secret and distributed to fewer than 50 recipients, reached conclusions that contradicted fundamental assumptions of American military doctrine. Small unit operations conducted by highly trained personnel achieved better results than large unit operations supported by overwhelming firepower. The Australian SAS kill ratio of approximately 17-1, compared to an overall Allied average of roughly 1-1, told the story in numbers that could not be ignored. Indigenous tracking methods, specifically Aboriginal techniques adapted to jungle warfare, provided intelligence capabilities that no technological system could replicate. Proposals to recruit Native American trackers for similar programs were submitted but never implemented, partly due to political sensitivities, and partly because the U.S. military establishment could not accept that traditional skills might outperform modern technology. Psychological warfare operations targeting enemy morale could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to the resources invested. A single 5-man patrol operating for 2 weeks could degrade enemy effectiveness more than a battalion-sized sweep and clear operation costing millions of dollars and requiring thousands of personnel. And most controversially, the classified annex noted that certain Australian practices regarding treatment of enemy dead and conduct of psychological operations would likely violate standing U.S. military directives if conducted by American forces. This final point ensured that the report remained classified for decades. The Pentagon had no interest in publicizing the fact that their most effective allies in Vietnam had succeeded partly by doing things American forces were prohibited from doing. The political implications were dangerous. The moral implications were uncomfortable. Better to let the Australian contribution fade into historical obscurity. But among special operations, communities worldwide, the lessons of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam became legend. Modern Special Forces training incorporates many of the techniques the Australians pioneered: small unit tactics, long-range reconnaissance, psychological operations designed to exploit enemy cultural beliefs, patient observation followed by surgical strikes. What cannot be replicated is the cultural component, the Aboriginal tracking skills, the willingness to become hunters rather than soldiers, the acceptance that effective operations sometimes require methods that exist in moral gray areas. The survivors speak. In the decades following the war, as Vietnam moved from active conflict to historical subject, some former Viet Cong personnel began speaking publicly about their experiences. Their accounts of fighting Australian forces reveal a level of fear and psychological impact that numbers alone cannot capture. One veteran, speaking through a translator for an Australian documentary, described patrols where soldiers would refuse to take point positions in areas where Australian forces were known to operate. He recounted instances where entire units would turn back rather than enter certain sections of jungle, claiming they could feel the presence of the ghosts even if they could not see them. Another former Viet Cong soldier described the terror of finding comrades arranged in those specific patterns: the sitting positions, the open eyes, the ace of spades. He said they knew it was psychological warfare. They knew human enemies, not spirits, were responsible. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different things. And when you found your friends dead in ways that matched the ghost stories from your childhood, rational knowledge could not entirely suppress primal fear. Perhaps most telling was the account of a former D445 battalion political officer who described trying to maintain revolutionary morale in the face of the phantom operations. He said they attempted everything. They distributed leaflets explaining that the Australians were using tricks, not magic. They held group meetings to discuss the scientific explanations for what was happening. They reassigned soldiers who showed too much fear. Nothing worked, because the fear was not based on belief in the supernatural. It was based on the very real experience of watching skilled operators kill with impunity and vanish without trace. Whether they were ghosts or highly trained soldiers made little difference to men who were dying. The effect was the same: terror, uncertainty, the gradual erosion of the will to fight. The human cost, the psychological transformation that made Australian SAS operators devastatingly effective in Vietnam, exacted a terrible price when they returned home. Post-traumatic stress rates among Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually exceed those of their American counterparts, despite serving in smaller numbers and sustaining fewer casualties. The men who learned to hunt humans in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. Many struggled to reintegrate into civilian society. The same predatory patience that made them excellent operators made them strangers in their own communities. They had learned to see the world through a hunter's eyes, always assessing threats, always planning escape routes, always ready for violence. Some found purpose in law enforcement or security work. Others disappeared into the bush country of rural Australia, seeking isolation where their adaptations to violence would not make them outcasts. Many simply suffered in silence, dealing with nightmares and flashbacks and the knowledge that they had become something civilization could not easily accommodate. The Aboriginal trackers faced additional burdens. They returned to communities where they still faced discrimination and marginalization. Many received no recognition for their service. Some were never even officially acknowledged as having served in Vietnam because record-keeping for Indigenous personnel was incomplete or actively suppressed. It would take decades for Australia to begin properly honoring the contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service members. Even today, the full extent of their participation in SAS operations remains partially classified, hidden behind the bureaucratic reluctance to acknowledge capabilities that might raise uncomfortable questions about how they were developed and employed. The final accounting. When the last Australian combat troops withdrew from Vietnam in December 1971, they left behind a legacy that military historians are still attempting to fully understand. The SAS had conducted nearly 1,200 combat patrols. They had killed or wounded over 600 enemy soldiers. They had provided intelligence that shaped Allied operations throughout Phuoc Tuy Province and beyond. But their real achievement was intangible. They had demonstrated that small, highly trained units employing unconventional tactics could achieve strategic effects out of all proportion to their numbers. They had proven that cultural knowledge and traditional skills could outperform technological superiority. They had shown that psychological operations, when properly designed and executed, could be more effective than conventional military action. And they had done all of this while operating under restrictions that would have crippled most units. They had no dedicated helicopter support initially, sharing assets with conventional forces. They had minimal backup, knowing that if a patrol got into serious trouble, extraction might be hours or days away. They operated in areas where simply being detected meant almost certain combat against numerically superior forces. The fact that they succeeded under these conditions speaks to the quality of their training, the effectiveness of their doctrine, and the courage of the men who executed the missions. But it also raises questions about the nature of warfare itself, about the ethics of psychological operations, about the line between legitimate military tactics and methods that cross into darker territory. Conclusion. The Viet Cong were not wrong to call the Australian SAS Ma Rung jungle ghosts, not because the Australians were supernatural, but because they operated in ways that seemed to defy natural explanation. They moved without sound through terrain that amplified the slightest careless step. They killed without warning and vanished without trace. They knew where enemy forces would be before those forces knew themselves. They achieved this through a combination of factors that would be nearly impossible to replicate. Aboriginal tracking skills passed down through 40,000 years of cultural transmission. Jungle warfare experience gained in Borneo under conditions that made Vietnam seem manageable. Selection and training processes that identified and developed individuals with the specific psychological profile needed for long-range reconnaissance operations, and, most importantly, a willingness to embrace methods that existed in the gray areas between conventional military operations and psychological warfare. The 580 men who served in the Australian SAS in Vietnam represent one of the most effective small unit forces in modern military history. Their kill ratio, their success in reconnaissance operations, and their psychological impact on enemy forces achieved results that far exceeded what their numbers would suggest possible. But perhaps their greatest legacy is the fear they instilled in their enemies. Not the crude terror of overwhelming violence, but the subtle, persistent dread of facing an enemy you could not see, could not predict, and could not fight. The knowledge that at any moment, without warning, death might come from the green wall of jungle that surrounded you. The certainty that somewhere in that jungle hunters were watching, waiting, planning. For the Viet Cong soldiers who survived encounters with Australian SAS patrols, that fear never entirely faded. Years after the war ended, decades after they returned to civilian life, they would remember, not with the clarity of traumatic memory, but with the vague unease of nightmare half-remembered, the feeling of being watched by eyes you could not see, the certainty that something was moving in the jungle, something that did not belong, something that came for you in the space between heartbeats. That was the true weapon of the Australian SAS in Vietnam, not their rifles or their explosives, not even their tracking skills or their tactical proficiency. Their weapon was fear itself, the fear that makes soldiers refuse orders, the fear that breaks unit cohesion, the fear that transforms effective guerrilla fighters into frightened men who jump at shadows and see threats in every rustle of leaves. And when that fear has its hooks in you, when you know that the jungle ghosts are real and hunting, all the political indoctrination, all the revolutionary fervor, all the promises of inevitable victory mean nothing, because victory requires the will to fight. And the Ma Rung stole that will, one disappeared patrol at a time, one staged body at a time, one ace of spades at a time. That is why a force of 150 men could accomplish what 500,000 could not. Not because they were stronger, or better armed, or more numerous, but because they understood something fundamental about human nature, about the power of fear, about the difference between defeating an enemy and breaking them. The Viet Cong who survived to tell their stories understood this too. They knew they had faced something in those jungles that changed them, something that made them question everything they thought they knew about courage, about warfare, about the nature of fear itself. They knew they had encountered the jungle ghosts, and they knew, with the certainty that comes from experience rather than belief, that some ghosts are real. Some ghosts wear combat boots. Some ghosts leave calling cards. And some ghosts never stop hunting, even after the war is over and the jungle has reclaimed the trails where blood once soaked into the earth. They didn't blink. That was what made them ghosts. They could stare at you across a jungle trail with eyes that had learned not to reveal intent, not to telegraph action, not to show mercy. They could wait with a patience that seemed inhuman, watching you walk toward your death with the certainty of predators who knew their prey had already lost. They could kill without hesitation and vanish without trace, leaving only the evidence of their presence in the arranged bodies and the fluttering cards and the spreading fear that infected every unit that operated in their territory. And when the Viet Cong survivors tried to explain what made the Australian SAS different from every other enemy they had faced, they always came back to that. The eyes, the patience, the certainty, the absolute refusal to blink even when death was inches away. because the men who did not blink owned the jungle, they owned the night, they owned the fear that lives in every soldier's heart, and they used that ownership with surgical precision to break an enemy that American firepower could not defeat. That is the story the numbers cannot tell. That is the legacy the official histories cannot capture. That is the truth that lives only in the whispered accounts of survivors who faced the jungle ghosts and lived to remember what it means to be hunted by men who had learned to become something more than human, something less than merciful, something absolutely and terrifyingly effective at the ancient art of killing without being killed. The Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts, the phantoms who made veteran guerrilla fighters afraid of their own territory, the hunters who proved that in the right hands, with the right training, with the right cultural knowledge, and the right psychological understanding, a small force could achieve what massive armies could not. They didn't blink, and neither did the fear they left behind.